Hey, welcome to Ask Me Today. Happy Monday. So we have a couple of questions that we'll be fielding about everything data evaluation and nonprofits. So feel free every week to submit your questions, and I'll be answering them every Monday morning and posting them on our channels. So the first question we have today comes from Stacy. She asks, how do you get program managers and staff to collect and share the data needed for reports to funders on time? We've tried checking in a few times a year and creating calendar reminders. They always seem to be late and act like the request came out of the blue. So, not the first time I've heard this, so I imagine lots of you out there have this similar question. It's really hard to get data sometimes. And as an external evaluator, we have the same kind of fight. So trust me, you're not alone. But what I have learned over the years is that one of the key things about data collection is making the people who are collecting data partners of yours. So making it less about extracting information and more about figuring out how to make the process more useful and easier. So the first place I would start is ask yourself, ask the organization, why are you collecting these particular data? So most likely they're from funders, it's a requirement, or they're something that the organization has established in the past. And so when you are writing grant applications, when you are setting those targets of what types of data, including the program staff in the process can be super helpful so that they can feel invested in the process and heard and feel like these are things that they actually want to be collecting. That's not always enough, but it's the starting point. Also ask yourself, how can we collect data that are more useful? So a lot of the time, resistance around data collection and data reporting comes from the fact that the data are sort of a waste of time. Like you're really only doing it to check a box or, fulfill your requirements to your funders, which you have to do. But can you, and you probably can, shift the data that you're collecting to either be collected or reported in a way that is more effectively or easily used by staff to actually know what's working and what's not working, and what can we do better, what should we be doing more of because it's working so well, and make that timing of when they're collecting and when they're reporting overlap with times that make sense with the program, because sometimes the grant period maybe is like a calendar year or something, but the program really has like specific start and end dates. And so having data that would be shortly after, for example, the last day of the last session, so that then they could go quickly into planning for the next round, something like that. Align the data collection so that it's part of the natural process of program implementation. Then it's less of like extra work for them. It also makes it more meaningful, and they're a little more rooted in the why. One thing I also regularly do with clients is to actually do monthly data collection and data reporting, even though in the end, the real report is due in a year or in 6 months. So maybe you only have an interim and annual report for your funders, but each month you could be organizationally collecting the data and then having, I call them like learning groups, but meetings where you have your staff and your leadership get together and they've pulled the data together and look at the data together and say, what does this tell us? What's working? What's not working? So what? Like, does this mean we should be doing more of something or doing less of something? Does it mean that there's a challenge we need to be overcoming? So having an intentional review of data on a regular basis that's actually more frequent than you're required to have for your funders can make it a lot more meaningful, and you're then collecting data along the way, so it's not as much stuff that you're trying to get from people at the last minute. I don't necessarily do this all the time, but I've seen other people do it successfully, of using like a co-working approach where they actually have people like block a time in the calendar where the program staff or managers, whoever's in charge of collecting and aggregating the data, all come together and they just are in the same space or on Zoom together or online and working through the data together, and then just popping up questions like, hey, do you guys have data on this? Or hey, do we have a hole here? What can we do about that? So that there's a little bit of community spirit to it, and there's a little bit of accountability at the same time. So definitely let me know how it goes as you try to use some of those strategies. The next question we have here. We have been implementing our program for 10 years and have lots of information about effectiveness, but people seem really hung up on the program having an experimental research study completed with data to show success. We haven't been able to get funding for an experimental study yet. How can we organize our data in a way that can be provided as evidence for funders and government agency partners? Big question. So the short answer is you probably don't actually need an experimental design. I know that maybe you've seen that and maybe people have asked for it. Maybe you've seen that as like the gold standard, but experimental designs. So an experimental design means that you have a randomly sampled control group and a randomly sampled experimental group. And so when you do your random sample, then like everyone in the entire population has exactly the same probability of being in your sample, which means in your program. And so that means like if you're trying to like say that my program works in the United States, then that means that every single person that's eligible for your program in the entire United States would have to have the equal chance of being in your sample, which is hugely unrealistic for most organizations. And then everyone in your sample, once they agree to participate after you do your sampling, they have to have equal chance, like randomly assigned to either the control or the experimental, which means that people can't self-select into the program or not. And those two requirements of an experimental design make it virtually impossible, but also like very inappropriate in many cases for you to actually do an experimental design as an evaluation. For example, like the biggest thing I see, because I deal with organizations that serve children and families, is that you can't actually tell, like, for example, a child, no, that child can't get this academic program because they were randomly assigned to the control group because maybe they really need it. And so you're actually withholding something that could be potentially beneficial. So you could actually be potentially doing harm. Politically, from like a cultural standpoint, you have parents who, when they advocate for their kids, I want parents to advocate for their kids, but it works. So when if a parent heard that their kid was missing out on an opportunity, then a lot of parents have a problem with that. But also from a logistical standpoint, from a design standpoint, the cost benefit sometimes of an experimental design doesn't make any sense. Like, it's quite expensive to do an experimental design because of the random sampling. You have to reach so many potential people. You have to go through such a rigorous sampling process in order to try to recruit people who have never heard of you necessarily, have no interest in you, and maybe you don't necessarily have enough money to get all of those people to be potentially interested in your study. There are lots of alternatives to the experimental design that are equally as rigorous. So quasi-experimental designs, I know it's a mouthful, but quasi-experimental designs are, in essence, the quasi part means fake. So fake experimental designs, and what those are they are designs that they have controls or comparisons, and they have the treatment group or the program group, the people who go through your services. But statistically, and also through some design, there's extraction of the difference. So the reason we like random sampling and random assignment is because it makes it so that if there's a difference between the 5 people in this group and the 5 people in this group on the first day, that difference is random. It's not systematic. It's not consistently in one direction. So if we don't randomly sample and randomly assign, then maybe one group consistently is higher in one area, or it has a very different characteristics than the other, and it's not due to just chance. So in order to control for that or extract that problem, get rid of that problem, we can use matching. So there's propensity score matching, and there's other types of matching you could use in order to make it so that you're only comparing person A in this group with these characteristics with person B in this other group that has very similar or the same characteristics. So that way you are comparing 2 groups that are composed of very similar people. Or you can do propensity score matching, which basically matches based on the likelihood that a person would be in the treatment group or not, which statistically is more complicated. So that's for another day. But so what it does is you're basically balancing the groups so that they are equal to each other or comparable to each other before you start to compare then the outcomes that you're measuring for your intervention. So there are ways to more cost effectively do very rigorous evaluation designs that should be able to still make pretty causal statements about the effect of your program. So if you're getting strong push for an experimental design, then we're talking potentially that funders are not aware of what they really need. And so think about some questions for you to consider are, which funders are really requiring this type of information from you? Why are they asking for such a high level of evidence? Is it really appropriate? Are there other funders that you can be working with or other alternative funding sources that actually would probably match better onto your program? And think about the different paths, like where does the experimental design get you and where does an alternative method get you? And can you, what would it take for you to bridge that gap to make them the same so that you can be equally successful without the experimental design? If you have relationships with the funders, then talk to them and explain to them why maybe an experimental design is unrealistic or not necessary, and how you would be willing to go in for a quasi-experimental design or something that's just rigorous but more cost-effective. So, long answers. Only 2 questions, but long answers. That's it for today. Hopefully we can keep it shorter, but cover a few more questions next week. But don't forget to submit your questions in the forum in the comment, and I'll be answering more questions next week. Bye for now.